Hello, welcome to episode 62 of Songs for the Struggling Artist, the blogcast. I'm Emily. Thank you for listening. I will confess something to you lovely people. The thing that I record over and over the most is this little section right here. Like, I know what I'm going to read to you, and I know usually what podcast I'm going to recommend to you, and I know what I'm going to tell you about the song. But this part, I'm just, feeling my way through. So I actually have no idea what I'm going to say. So sometimes I start talking, and then I'm like, oh, what the hell? Why am I saying that? And of course, I'm sure that none of that has anything to do with the fact that I am a lady person and have been taught quite well by the culture that what I have to say is probably just a little bit silly. It's probably not worth it. It's dumb. Why are you talking? Yeah, anyway, so thanks for listening. Today, it feels all the more important to actually say stuff, even if it doesn't feel like it's easy to, because this podcast today, this blogcast today is about sexist jerks. Everybody's favorite, right? So this is a little bit about Patreon, which is how do I describe it? Well, it's like a patronage system. I've been on it sort of since it started, not right at the beginning, but pretty close. It's how I make a little bit of money from doing art type things like making this podcast and writing the blog and so on. So it's pretty cool, Patreon, or at least I thought it was. I still think it is. It's just been taken over by some sexist jerks, and you will hear why in the blog that I will read to you now, which is called, Apparently, Being a Sexist Jerk Pays Well. Apparently, being a sexist jerk pays well. Perhaps this isn't news to you. Probably especially not this year. Not in 2017, when we've seen one of the biggest sexist jerks around continue to profit on his sexual jerkholery. But this isn't about that. This is about a smaller corner of the sexist landscape. One of my feminist heroes is Anita Sarkeesian, who has been making videos at Feminist Frequency since 2009. My personal favorites were her looks at Legos and her explanation of the Bechdel test. This was before the Bechdel test was common knowledge, an evolution that I suspect Sarkeesian had a hand in. You may have started to hear about her after her Kickstarter campaign to make videos about women in video games triggered a terrible hate campaign against her. And then the parade of horrors known as Gamergate began to target her as well. I recently read an article about her experience of speaking on a panel at a video conference and being harassed in person. There's a lot to take in this article, but the thing that shook me rather badly was the fact that two of the leaders of Gamergate and Sarkeesian's harassers-in-chief both make their living from making videos about their harassment and get their support through Patreon. The article reports that one makes $5,000 a month from his videos and the other $3,000 a month. Why did this particular fact shake me? Because I use Patreon too. I think of it as a noble enterprise providing funding for artists of all kinds, a new patronage. Knowing that the architects of one of the most infamous harassment campaigns in the last few years are receiving support on the same platform that I use makes me incredibly uncomfortable. And the fact that they make 6 times more than I do at it makes me feel even worse. The disturbing truth would appear to be that being a sexist harasser is more profitable than being a feminist writer. And it has likely always been thus. Patreon is just highlighting a pattern that has been long established in the culture. It seems like capitalism works really well for sexists. That may be one reason the sexism sticks around. Also, in the wake of recent events, it has come to light that a great many of the men in white supremacist movements got their start in MRA movements. That is, Gamergate was the gateway drug for joining the ranks of white supremacy. The one thing mass murderers and terrorists have in common is a tendency to be domestic abusers. It is the number one predictor of future violence. I mean, it makes sense. If you begin by not seeing women as human beings, by being cruel and threatening to people you don't see as people, by fantasizing about violence, why not expand into hating more people? You've already begun by hating half the population. You might as well, I guess. There is a major connection between these men's inability to see women as people and leaning into white victimhood. As this article in The Cut says, if you can convince yourself that men are the primary victims of sexism, it's not hard to convince yourself that whites are the primary victims of racism. I wrote the first draft of this blog earlier this summer, before the invasion of Charlottesville, before the lid was removed from the pot on the depth of depravity of the revitalized white supremacists, and some things have changed and some things have not. On the plus side, some tech companies stood up and denied service to hate groups they were previously hosting. Patreon sort of is and sort of isn't standing up on this point. They removed right-wing activist Lauren Southern from their platform. This led her supporters to invent something called Hatreon, where I guess hate groups can crowdfund themselves in peace. Anyway, it turns out this woman didn't get cut from the platform because she's spewing hate. She got cut for risky behavior. Meanwhile, Sarkeesian's harasser-in-chief has increased his monthly take on Patreon from $5,000 to $8,000 in the last few months. That is $5,000 to $8,000 per month in the last few months. It's not getting better, folks. It's getting worse. When I read this story about Sarkeesian's experience, I thought, should I leave Patreon? Is it right to be a part of a platform that enables sexist harassers? And I think if there were another platform like Patreon, I would switch to it immediately. Like actual Arteon? No Nazis, just Arteon? I don't know. I thought Patreon was a place for artists, not harassment campaigns. But as no one has yet developed an artist funding platform for feminists, I think my best move is to stay where I am and somehow find a way to at least match the funding of the Sexist Jerk Brigade. So, if you want to help this feminist writer do at least as well as a sexist jerk, click on Patreon to find out about becoming a patron. It's possible, right? For a feminist to do better than a sexist? Damn, I hope so. And it doesn't have to be me. I want to boost feminists and artists of color and people with disabilities and anyone else who is particularly vulnerable to the evils of hate. I did a search in Patreon, and I gotta tell you, my extremely unscientific survey says it pays a whole lot more to be a sexist jerk than to be a feminist. Or just to be a woman. Here are some things I found on Patreon, some lists of people you could support. Feministing for Change, Women in Comics Collective International, Disability Visibility Project, STEM and Disability Activism, transgender civil rights activist Danielle Moscato, Marina Watanabe, Feminist Fridays, A Feminist Paradise, Feminist Killjoys, PhD, Monica Byrne, feminist sci-fi writer, Faithless Feminist, Bree May, disability queer mental health advocate. I found all of these people during searching. If you are a feminist or intersectional activist on Patreon, please let me know so I can boost you on my page as well. I want us all to do better than the sexist jerks. This is going to be my new rallying cry. If I go to a march, I'm just going to be like, let's do better than sexist jerks. I'm sure it'll catch on. Let's all do better than sexist jerks. Anyway, I have changed my my Patreon page. So I hadn't set it. There's this thing where you're supposed to set up goals, like how much money you want to be making. And I hadn't set that up because, like, I don't know. What? You're supposed to say, like, if I if I make this amount of money, I will do X or Y, Z. And I was like, yeah, I'll do that stuff. But it just wasn't a priority for me. But then so now I've changed it. So the goals on my page are now going to be, for the first one, the first level is like to do at least as well as the lowest level sexist jerk. And the second one is to do as well as the higher sexist jerk. And then the third goal is to do better than both sexist jerks combined. So this is how I'm setting my goals. And what's crazy is like these goals are much higher than the goals I would have set for myself just to like be like, oh, I'm going to take the advertising off my blog. Like I would have set that bar a lot lower, but not anymore, folks. I'm setting that bar high to do at least as well as a sexist jerk. So yeah, if you want to join me, that'd be awesome. I'm on patreon.com/ I think it's Emily RD, but I'm not entirely sure. Just you can look me up. I'm Emily Davis on Patreon. The link will be in the show notes. So if you're into that, do it up. My Patreon is slightly different than a lot of the current ones because I started early. In the early days, you could only set it up to pay you per project. So my Patreon is set up to pay per blog post. So a lot of people in recent years, I think it's even just recent months, I don't know, in the last year probably, have set it up so that there's like a way to do payment per month. Like you can set up to pay like $1 a month or $2 a month or whatever. I may switch to that. I haven't heard from anyone that that's something that they want, so I'm keeping it as it is because it's working a bit, and it does help to motivate me to make sure that I keep posting blogs. So that's all fine. But certainly do let me know if you would be more into it if it was a monthly thing rather than a per art project thing. Yeah, anyway, that's my push for I mean, it's partly like, yeah, please support me on Patreon. That's great. But like, also let's support other women on Patreon, feminists on Patreon, women of color, especially on Patreon. It seriously doesn't have to be me. I would be delighted, of course, if it were me, but it doesn't have to be. Yeah. I mean, I will say Monica Byrne is the only person on that list who's even close. And she is like a poster child for Patreon. We're Facebook friends, so I know her sort of. And I, so she's doing the best out of anybody, but even she is not doing as well as the lowest level sexist jerk. And she's like a pretty well-beloved, published sci-fi writer with a video series on Vice and so on. So even the best one who's doing the best is not doing as well as the lowest level sexist jerk. I mean, if we count Amanda Palmer, I'm not actually sure what Amanda Palmer's take is, but she might be beating the sexist jerks, but she's not explicitly there. I mean, she's a recording artist who's pretty successful already, so I'm not sure I can really count her, although I adore her. So anyway, that's a lot of stuff about Patreon. If you hear about another artist funding platform, let me know. Because, yeah, I feel undersupported, shall we say, by Patreon. But I would like to be supported on Patreon. In any case, for today's podcast recommendation, I wanted to find you a podcast on Patreon that I can recommend to you wholeheartedly so that if you love it, you can support it. But interestingly, I could not find a podcast on Patreon hosted by, say, a woman or a woman of color or any of these things that I would like to be supporting. The only one I found was I listened to it and I was like, I'd never heard it before, and for whatever reason the episode didn't thrill me, so I'm not gonna recommend that one to you. But I will recommend even though this is, I mean, it's interesting. Like, are women not using Patreon? I guess that's my question. And I would say that most of the podcasts that I listen to that are hosted by women are not. They are supported by, say, like WNYC or public radio in some fashion. There aren't a lot of independently produced podcasts by women so far. But that said, since I've already recommended to you the independently produced podcast by a woman several times, I'm going to recommend to you some podcasts hosted by men. But they are super interesting and both on Patreon. So You Are Not So Smart is one that is on Patreon. I know the host has been on Patreon maybe as long as I have, maybe just right after he joined, I think. But it is an interesting look at like social psychology and some fallacies that we have and how we get turned around by our brains. It's pretty interesting. He'll have, he usually has some interesting guests on. It's not that much different than, say, Hidden Brain, which is a WNYC, I think it's WNYC, podcast, which sort of looks at this similar ideas. It's a little bit more indie, though. You Are Not So Smart is it's hosted by a guy. He's probably sitting in his living room, just like I'm sitting in my apartment, talking to you. So there's that. And then also there is Well Read, which is, I don't know if you guys saw a video. There was like a really viral video series by the liberal redneck. His name is Trey Crowder. He's a comedian. But he's gotten together with two of his buddies and they record a podcast called Well Read, and they just joined Patreon. They are three guys from the South, and they are very funny, and they are also pretty woke. So that is it. For me, it is comforting to hear, especially because, since I'm from the South, it is like the voices are comforting to me. But they're also like looking at what's happening in the world. So they are also on Patreon. Well Read and You Are Not So Smart. And if someone comes across a female-hosted podcast that you like that is on Patreon, let me know so I can plug it on my blog. All right, there's all the things. So today's song, my friends, is it's a Billy Bragg song again. I'm in a. So I think I go through phases where I'm like, I have to sing. I was like, for a while there at the beginning, like when the things first went south, in November, it was like all Michelle Shocked all the time, and then I was in a Crowded House phase for a while, and we've moved into the Billy Bragg phase apparently. This is Billy Bragg's "The Only One." Sometimes when you lose your way to me, I think you don't care at all. If you don't get here soon, I'll tear that clock down from the wall. Your family and friends don't understand. They treat me so strange. The book you said to read, well, I have read, but nothing's changed. The clock goes forward, the clock goes back, yet here I sit as if I were the only one, and no, you cannot hear me. Oh, you cannot hear me. Can anybody hear me out there? He's up on his high horse again. You're down in the park. I'm left to fight my impulses alone here in the dark. The chain that fell off my bike last night is now wrapped round my heart. Sometimes I think that fate has been against us from the start. I long to let our love run free, yet here I am, the victim of geography. And oh, you cannot hear me. Oh, you cannot hear me. Can anybody hear me out there? He said, kiss me, or would you rather live in a land where the soap won't lather? And oh, you know you are the only one. Yes, you are the only one. You know you are the only one. Don't you know you are the only one? Oh, you know you are the only one. You know you are the only one. Yes, you are the only. You know you are the only. Yes, you are the only.